I didn't learn a whole lot about race growing up on the back roads of Vermont, and I sure didn't learn about race in a university. I learned about race in federal prison, and today I want to share, or try to share, some of what I experienced and some of what I learned. Because what I've found, both in prison and since coming home, is that what I learned there is not something that's often talked about in normal circles. So here goes. The first time, or one of the first times I walked into the chow hall in Raybrook Federal Correctional Institution near Lake Placid, New York. It's a medium security prison. And one of the first times I walked in the chow hall, there was a lieutenant standing at the doorway, watching to make sure guys had their uniforms on and their shirts were tucked in and everything was the way it should be. And as guards like to do, always to remind us that they were there. This was the first time I'd seen this lieutenant, and it was the first time he had seen me. And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, look, a white guy." And he winked at me as though to say that things would be all right. And I didn't know much about how things worked here, so I didn't know what to say or do. I knew it didn't feel good. I knew immediately that somehow I was going to be treated differently here and that I would have some kind of choice about what I did with that. Back in our unit, it was a small unit. It was a minimum security unit within a medium security prison, which isn't supposed to happen in the Bureau of Prisons, but nobody really cares. Bottom line, what happens or what is supposed to happen and what isn't supposed to happen in prison. So they did it because that's what they needed to do. And in our unit, there were black cells and there were white cells. This was not a decision made by the prison. This was a decision made by the inmates. And so when I arrived looking like the newbie that I absolutely was, I was put into one of the white cells. And there were 4 different tiers. There were 2 sides in our unit, 2 tiers on each unit, and there were 4 tiers. And this was the only tier that was racially integrated. There were some white guys on this lower tier, and there were some black guys. And I was put in the cell on the end with a white cellmate. You never mix. Inmates don't choose to mix black and white cellmates. It's the most segregated, polarized, tribal community I've ever lived in, prison. And so I was moved into the cell with a white guy, and I settled in as best as I could and got to know him a little bit. And over time, this was in the late fall, over time it got cold. And I didn't know this when I moved in, but our cell was the coldest one because it was way on the far end, farthest away from the heaters. And the whole downstairs tier was cold because the heat, it was an open space and the heat rose up to the second tier. And the guys at the second tier, I couldn't believe this, but it just was the way it was. The second tier was all white guys, completely white. The guys who had been there the longest, the guys who had worked their way up to the second tier. The other side of the unit was all black and Spanish. And in prison, I should say, you don't say Hispanic or African American. It's white, it's black, and it's Spanish. If you speak Spanish, you're Spanish in prison. At least that's the way it was in Raybrook. And one day, as winter was really coming on, it was cold on the first tier. It was really cold. It was probably maybe low 50s. And in the concrete, cold metal cells, it was cold. And came to find out that the guys on the upper tier were hot because the heat was rising. So they were opening their windows and the cold air was coming down and the heat was rising and they were letting it out the windows and we were freezing on the first tier. And I was the white guy on the first tier and I was supposed to be in solidarity with the white guys. But one day, one of the black guys on my tier, he called himself Money, came out and he said he got in a shouting match with the guys on the upper tier, and he said, "Damn, man, you guys got to close your fucking windows. It's cold down here." And long and the short of it, they got into a shouting match, and it was white against black, one black guy against the whole upper tier standing there along the railing. And I jumped into the middle of this, and I came out and I stood beside the black guy, and I said, "Hey, guys, come on. He's right. It's fucking cold down here. You guys got to close your windows. You got to find some other way to deal with this because this is just, it's nasty down here." And this was the first time I crossed these racial lines in prison. I knew that I was going to have a choice, and it wasn't really even a choice. It was just instinct, just something that kicked into me. What was right was right. A few months later than that, when I was still the new guy, we heard the rumor that there was going to be a new guy coming into our unit, and he was black, and he was going to be assigned to one of the units downstairs. And when he came in, as the last new guy who had come in, I knew what it was like. And so I greeted him and I said, "Hey," his name was Ray. I greeted him. I said, "My name's Mac. I've got some shower shoes. I got a sweatshirt. I got an extra blanket. I got some food." And I brought it to him. And he was suspicious as I learned that any movement across these racial lines was usually met at first with suspicion because the culture was so tribal, so separate, so segregated. There were white TVs and black TVs and white cells and black cells and the whole thing. But I just gave him this stuff and I said, "I don't need anything from you, just wanted to welcome you. I'm the last new guy that came in here. I just wanted to welcome you to the unit." And he thanked me a little suspiciously, but he thanked me and he settled in and we kept talking. Neither of us had a job at that point, and so we would sit around we were both new, and so we settled in and sat at the table in front of the TV, getting to know each other. And excuse me, I gotta close my window here. Somebody else has pulled into the spot where I am. So we got to know each other, and he began to trust me a little bit more and more. He was from the Bronx, and he found out I was from Vermont, and he learned I didn't have an agenda. One of the first things you need to get over in prison if you're an older white guy is that's the profile for a child molester. I didn't know that, but in prison, if you're an older white guy, one of the immediate suspicions is that you might be a child molester. They call them chomos in prison. And so we got to know each other and we became friends, and he told me about the Bronx and I told him about Vermont. I didn't tell him a lot about Vermont, but we just became friends. And I learned that in prison you have to work. If you want a friendship across racial lines, you have to work for it because it's not normal. Another guy that I got to be friends with, I got on a softball team the next summer, and I was playing first base because I was older and I couldn't run around the outfield the way I used to, but I could catch and I was a good first baseman. So they put me at first base. I was tall, so I could stretch and get the high throws, and I had I had a good eye, so I could scoop ground balls and good reflexes. And there was a black guy who was umpiring first base where I was playing, and we started chatting back and forth. And I found out his name was Bird. And he watched me play, and he laughed at me. He just laughed because he said, "Damn, Parker, I got to get some of what you're getting, because we're the same age. We're both in our late 50s, but I don't know how you do it, but I got to get some of whatever you're eating, I got to get some of it." So we became friends, and one time late in the game, there was a ground ball right down the first baseline. And here I am, an old guy, and I dove for it. Dove flat out on the ground, and I caught it in my glove, and I was trying to get up to run to first base, but I was too old and clunky to get up, so I just crawled across the ground, reached out, and touched the bag with my glove, and Bird said, "Out!" And then he just started to laugh. He said, "Parker, you are crazy. I don't know how the hell you do it, man, or I don't know what they feed you in Vermont, but man, you're my new hero." And we just got to be the best of friends. The best of friends. He was on the hill. He was in the medium section of the prison, up on the hill, and the units on the hill. And so we didn't see each other. We couldn't be in the same building, but we could meet at the library. We could walk the track, and we did. And we became just best friends. He told me he was from Philadelphia. And Bird was he was an older guy, an older black guy, and he was really respected on the compound. He didn't really fit the mold, but they call him the shot caller for the guys from Philadelphia. And he was the kind of shot caller that always brought new guys food and would make a bowl. They call a bowl. You had plastic. You don't have plates in prison, but you have these plastic, containers, and you make somebody a bowl of food, noodles and cheese and salami and whatever else you can put together, tomato sauce, and he would make people a bowl on their birthdays. So he was really beloved and really respected black guy on the compound. And he was the only one I got to know who didn't really care that I was white and he was black. We were just friends, and he wasn't shy about it. He would, lots of times I would get to know somebody, a black guy. Maybe I'd take a class with him or meet him in the library and have a conversation with him. And then in the dining hall, they'd kind of pretend like they didn't know me, because you just weren't supposed to cross these lines. But Bird would come in the dining hall, and I'd be sitting there in the white section because everything was segregated. I'm there in the white section. And Bird would come in, and he'd call out across the whole chow hall. I'd say, "Hey, Parker!" And I'd say, "Hey, Bird, how's it going?" And there was just a real joy for both of us in crossing this, de facto segregation and tribalism. And we loved each other. And I'll talk more about him as this goes on. There was another guy I met him in education. His name was Walter. He was from, I think it was from Indianapolis, somewhere in one of the cities in Indiana. And he was a very thin, small black man, but he was very smart. And we talked in education, and then we kind of, and he was kind of curious about this idea of making friends with this older white guy. That wasn't something that happened every day of the week for him. And we became friends too, and we would walk the track or talk in education. But sometimes I would joke with Walter, because I knew, it just didn't happen a lot to see a white guy and a black guy walking the track. It just wasn't how things worked on that compound. So I would just joke with him. I'd say, "Okay, if we see any of your friends, Walter, you can step away. It's all right." Or other days when I'd be walking and I'd see him walking with one of his black buddies, and I'd say, "It's okay, Walter. I won't say anything. Don't worry. I ain't going to break your cover." um, but we just got to be friends too, and we worked for it. And every connection across these racial divides, you had to work for it. You had to feed it every day. You had to build that trust because the trust was gone. It wasn't there. It was broken. It didn't happen naturally. It wasn't an open culture where you could just meet somebody and say, oh, you're cool, you're cool. Yeah, let's be friends. You had to work for it. One day I was, one evening in the library, in what they call education, but it was also the library. I was taking a class, and I was taking a class with a white guy who was teaching about, I forget the whole content, but he was teaching people about, some principles of life, taking responsibility for yourselves, and, what to do when you leave prison and go back to your communities. And it was a good class, and I liked it, and I was meeting people that I wasn't meeting in my unit because most of the guys in the class were from the medium facility on the hill. And I came out of the class, and there was a black guy standing there, and nice-looking, really handsome, strong, muscular black guy. Probably, he was younger than I was. He was probably maybe 40. And he came up to me and he asked me, so how's the class? And I said, it's good. It's really good. Chad's doing a good job. Chad was the guy teaching it. And he said, good. And I said, how come you're not in the class? And he said, oh, I can't. I'm banned on the compound. I'm not allowed to participate in education or classes. And I said, what? How come? And he said, I'll tell you about it another time. But Chad's a buddy of mine. I've been teaching him these principles. We're in the same unit up on the hill. And I forget I think it was Mohawk. They were all Indian names, the names of the units. And he said, I think it was Mohawk. And we're in the same unit, and I've been teaching him these things because I wrote a book about this. This is a program I've been putting together, and they won't let me teach it. So I've been sharing it with Chad, and Chad's teaching it. And I said, oh, that's cool. So I'd like to. So I got to know him too. I'd run into him on the track, or I'd run into him in education, and we'd talk. And finally I asked him, I said, so what happened? How come they won't let you teach? How come they won't let you do education? I mean, what the hell? Aren't we supposed to get education here? And so he told me this story. He had been in another prison somewhere down south. I think it was South Carolina or something like that, closer to his home. And he said he'd been in this prison, and he'd been going to education, and he'd been teaching classes. And then there was a woman who worked in education, a white woman. And this is totally taboo. It's absolutely not supposed to do in prison. It's not supposed to happen. It's taboo for the inmates. It's taboo for the guards or the prison officers or teachers or whatever they are, but they fell in love. A black man and a white woman fell in love. And of course, they couldn't ever see each other privately, but they would talk in education. He would go into her office and, for conversations or tutoring or whatever, and they fell in love. The problem was that she was the wife of the SIS lieutenant on the compound. And one day she came into education, and she had a black eye. And my friend's name was Cedric. His name was Cedric Dean. And Cedric looked at her, and he knew something was wrong. And he said, okay, what happened? And finally, he got the story out of her. And of course, it was her husband, the SIS lieutenant on the compound, who had beaten her up. And Cedric was furious. And it's a very long story, and I don't have time to tell the whole thing here, but basically he reported, an inmate reported the SIS lieutenant to the authorities for abusing his wife. And that didn't go over so well. a black inmate reporting a white SIS lieutenant for abusing his wife. The SIS lieutenant's Special Investigative Services. It's a special, they're they're like investigators. What do you call it? The word is escaping me. Detectives that look into crimes that are happening on the compound. So this was this guy's position. It's one of the most powerful CO positions on the compound. And they blackballed Cedric. They just came down on him with everything that they could. They got him, they sent him to the hole, to solitary confinement. They transferred him to another prison. He had a black mark on his record, for, I don't know what the hell they called it, but anyway, he came, where they sent him was to Raybrook, which is in northern New York State, almost to the Canadian border, way, way far away from his home and his family in the South. They sent him to Raybrook, and they sent him with this black mark on his record, and he could not teach, he could not do programs, he could not even take programs. And at this point, I was working in the visiting room, and I had daily contact with the SIS lieutenant at Raybrook, because he had to walk through the visiting room where I was cleaning up to get to his office. And he would stop and talk to me and say, "Parker, I'd like to see you cleaning up the chairs." He said, "I don't like greasy chicken on the chairs," because the officers would have meetings and things in the visiting room during the week when the visiting room wasn't being used. He said, "I hate that greasy chicken on the chairs. You make sure to be wiping down the chairs." And I said, "Yes, sir. Okay, thank you. I will." So he was probably a little younger than me. He was probably in his 40s. But we had a kind of kinship. He knew I grew up in Vermont, and we would talk about things here and there. And so I told my friend Cedric, I said, "Listen, I know the SIS lieutenant here. Let me talk to him about this." And this is not something you do. Inmates don't go to the SIS lieutenant, because if you do, and if you get caught by other inmates, they think you're a rat. They think you're telling on them. They think, so it was a risky thing to do. But I said, let me talk to, his name was Shipman. Let me talk to Lieutenant Shipman and see if he'll do anything about this. I know him. I have a pretty good contact with him, and let me see what I can do. So I made an appointment to go talk to the SIS lieutenant, which again was not something you are supposed to do in prison. But I went to him and I said, "Look, Lieutenant, I just want to let you know about something that's happening on the compound here." And I told him the story that Cedric had told me, and I said, "Look, you are the SIS lieutenant here. You know damn well how somebody would respond if an inmate told on you, got you in trouble, even trouble potentially with the law. You know how hard somebody's going to come down on that inmate." And I said, "Look, I know this guy. I've made friends with him. He's a good guy. He has things to teach. Is there anything you can do to get him off this blacklist so he can participate in education and teach classes and just be a fully participating inmate on the compound here?" And to his credit, Lieutenant Shipman listened to me, and they took the black mark off his record, and they let him participate. So I learned in prison. I'll tell you one more story. This is long, but it's turned into a long video, but it's all important. I've told this story on another video here, but it's important to this context. I sat in the white section. I decided this was not a fight I was going to have. I just, I was here in prison, and there were certain things that I just wasn't going to fight. But I sat at a table that was near the door, and it was right next to the table where some of the white gay inmates sat. And that was fine with me, and it was fine with other people. We had a table. There's only 4 to a table, but we had a table of regulars who would sit there, and they were fine. There were no problem with the white gay inmates. People would occasionally make comments about this or that or jokes, but it wasn't the serious, like nasty, violent homophobia that you might expect in prison. So the white gay inmates were fine. And then one day, one of the white gay inmates invited 2 black gay inmates to sit at their table with them. So not only was this table now gay, but there were also black inmates at this table. Black gay inmates. And that was a bridge too far for the white section. And one of the white guys from another table, I didn't know him real well, but I'd seen him many times. He was from the medium, and he knew I was from the minimum security unit. And he came up to me. One day I was sitting at the table alone by myself, and he came up to me all kind of puffed up, and he said, "Parker, the situation at the table next door, you got to take care of this. We cannot have black guys sitting." I don't remember word for word, but basically, ain't no black people going to sit in our section here, and you got to put a stop to this. And somehow, because I sat next to this table, this was my responsibility. And I just looked at him. I didn't even think about it. And I said, "Fuck you. Fuck you. First of all, this is not my table. This is not your table. And I am not here to tell other inmates who are just like me where they can or cannot sit." And he was shocked, because this was against the code. This was against the tribal code where everybody sits together. Everybody sticks together. And if you don't stick together, you are isolated and you are on your own. But I said, listen, I didn't grow up in the 60s. I didn't go through the civil rights movement to come here and be a spokesman for segregation. So that ain't happening. So first of all, don't fucking tell me what to do when you don't even know me. And don't tell me to do this. I'm not doing it. And he was shocked and he was angry, and he said, "You will pay for this. We will not forget." And I said, "Good, you don't forget, because I will not forget either what you just told me to do." So I sat there, and I sat there at that table, and I sat alone at that table, because everyone else, all the other white guys, were told to leave that table and to leave me there on my own. And they did. So I sat there alone at that table, and I was not going to fucking leave that table. I didn't care what happened. I didn't care how isolated I got. It wasn't going to happen. And I talked to the guys at the table next to me. I made friends with the black guys. I made friends, I already was friends with the white guys, and they weren't all gay, but most of them were. And after this, pretty much all of them were gay. And I made friends with them, and I talked with them. So I learned that if you want to really I learned in prison where racial attitudes are really, really deeply entrenched, where the polarization, the segregation, the tribalism, whatever you want to call it, this gang, that gang, the blacks from Philadelphia, the blacks from New York, the blacks from Buffalo, they're all separate. Everybody had their own group. And if you wanted to make connections across these boundaries, you had to work for it. And you had to earn it. And you had to show balls. And you had to show courage. And that's what I did. And I think I'm going to wrap this up shortly here, but what I want to move into talking about is the way, in my experience, that white people relate to racism and racial divides and conflicts in our culture is mostly bullshit. It's mostly based on guilt. It's mostly based on making yourself so small and so apologetic. Well, we're really sorry for everything that's happened to you, poor black people, and blah, 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 blah. And we apologize for what's happened to you. We apologize for our privilege. And I just find this to be mostly bullshit. And I'll talk more about this. This has gotten long, but I will talk more about this probably in another video. But what I learned from myself is if you want to make connections across racial divide, you got to come at it with a big heart. And you got to come at it with compassion. And yes, you got to come at it with an understanding of why these divides are there to begin with, of the whole history of racism and racial oppression and slavery, the whole mix of it. You got to come at it with that. But you got to come at it with heart. You got to come at it with balls. You got to come at it with courage. If you're coming at it feeling guilty, guilty people, weak people don't make good allies. It takes courage. It takes commitment. It takes dedication. It takes humility. It takes a willingness to learn, but it also takes a willingness to stand in your own strength. I understand why the idea of white privilege is there, but I hate how it's applied in our culture. My experience of white privilege, the analogy that I came up with is white privilege is kind of like if you're driving along in a big SUV with a trailer hook and four-wheel drive and you see somebody in their little sedan, two-wheel drive sedan that's stuck in the ditch, and you stop in your big SUV sitting high up there and you say, gee, I'm so sorry you're stuck in the ditch. I really wish there was something that I could do. And then you fucking drive off. That's what white privilege is to me. That's how we use it. We apologize, but we don't do squat. And so my whole approach, it wasn't even a decision. It wasn't even a choice I made. It was really just something that happened. If I had white privilege, as I learned that first day with that first lieutenant and said, hey, look, a white guy, and nodded at me like I was going to be okay. If I had white privilege, I was goddamn well going to use it. And that's what I did. And that's the spirit and the fire that I brought to trying to cross these racial divides in what must be one of the most difficult places to do that. So if we have white privilege, let's use it. Let's not be guilty about it. Let's not apologize. Let's not, oh, I'm so sorry I'm white and you're black. Let's be what we are. Let's be the strongest, most powerful, most passionate, most intelligent version of what a white person can be. And let's use that privilege, so-called privilege, for other people's benefit. Let's hook our SUV onto somebody that's stuck in the ditch and let's fucking help them. Let's not just drive away and feel guilty. More about this to come. It's a really dicey conversation to begin because it's a mess and we all know it's a mess. And in my opinion, the ways that we're trying to address this mess, almost none of them work. And almost none of them really get to the heart of the problem. And I'm not saying I'm a genius about this. I'm just one guy who had my experience. And it's not an experience that I see shared often or with much care or passion. And that's what I want to try to do here. So I don't know what I'll title this video yet, but thank you so much for coming. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening through here to the end. If you like this, please like, subscribe, comment, share your thoughts with me. I'd love to hear your stories of how you have crossed these divides and what you've learned in the process. So thank you for coming here today. I expect to do another one about this soon. I don't know where it'll go from here, but I expect to follow up soon. And I thank you for watching this one, and I hope to see you again here next time. Thank you.